Hi guys, and welcome to Bedtime History Relaxing. Tonight we begin a journey that does not feel like a straight line through time, but more like the slow unfolding of scent itself, drifting through human memory, curling through smoke and settling into the most ordinary moments of survival and desire. You're not just learning history here, you're walking inside it. Barefoot on soil that still remembers the first time something aromatic changed the way humans thought about food. And yes, you probably won't survive this level of fascination without getting a little hungry along the way. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you want, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. It is strangely comforting to imagine this voice drifting across different time zones while the world quietly turns. Now, dim the lights. You begin in a world before written empires, before ships stitched continents together, before any system existed to standardize taste or preserve recipes in anything more permanent than memory. Food is not yet an industry or even a tradition in the way you would recognize it. It is necessity first. Instinct second, and accident quite often, and yet even here, something beftoortel is already happening. Humans are experimenting with what makes survival not just possible, but tolerable. You walk through early human settlements where wild plants are gathered with careful attention. Not everything is eaten. Some leaves sting too sharply, some roots are too bitter. Some seeds create warmth in the body that early people begin to associate with healing. This is where spices begin, not as luxury, but as trial and error shaped by hunger and curiosity. A handful of crushed seeds added to a simple broth might make the difference between something barely edible and something worth remembering. A widely accepted historical understanding is that early humans relied heavily on foraging a wide variety of plant materials, gradually identifying certain aromatics that had preservative or medicinal effects. This is not yet cuisine. It is survival learning how to become slightly more refined. And in that refinement, you can already sense the future outline of global trade systems that will one day move these tiny plant parts across oceans. You step closer into these early moments and notice something quieter. Smoke rising from open fires carries more than heat. It carries scent upward into branches and cave openings. When leaves, bark, or seeds are accidentally thrown into flames, the air changes. It becomes sharper, warmer, sometimes strangely comforting. Early humans begin to associate these camels with safety, warmth, and gathering. It is not documented knowledge yet, but it is deeply felt. A quirky archaeological observation suggests that traces of aromatic plant residues have been found in ancient cooking sites far earlier than formal agriculture. It is as if humans were already seasoning long before they could explain why they were doing it. Whether this was intentional or accidental remains a subject of quiet academic disagreement. Historians still argue whether early spice use was deliberate culinary enhancement or a byproduct of medicinal experimentation. The evidence does not speak clearly, but it whispers enough to suggest intention slowly forming inside a habit. You move through time and notice how certain plants begin to carry meaning beyond nutrition. A resin that soothes coughs, a bark that reduces pain, a seed that makes fatigue feel slightly lighter. These effects are not understood scientifically, but they are remembered socially. Knowledge spreads slowly, passed through observation, repetition, and trust rather than writing. One person notices, another repeats, and gradually entire groups begin to prefer certain flavors without fully knowing why. And here is something interesting. Taste itself is not stable yet. It is being shaped alongside survival. What feels pleasant today might have been unfamiliar generations earlier. Humans are essentially teaching themselves how to enjoy the world through their mouths, and spices, in their earliest forms, are part of that education. You might picture these early scenes as quiet and simple, but they're not static. Movement exists everywhere, People travel in small groups, carrying bundles of plants tied with fiber or bark strips. They do not yet understand trade networks. But exchange already exists. One group finds something useful in one region. Another group values something different elsewhere. When they meet, even briefly, knowledge passes between them like sparks. A mainstream historical fact is that prehistoric human groups engaged in extensive exchange of goods and knowledge long before formalized markets existed. These exchanges included not just tools and materials, but also plant knowledge that would eventually become the foundation of culinary spice systems. You feel the beginnings of something larger forming here, though no one living in this moment would recognize it. There are no empires yet, no merchant classes, no global roots, but there is curiosity, there is experimentation, and there is memory, the most important ingredient of all. You pause in a landscape that feels both familiar and distant. Rivers cut slowly through earth. Forests are dense but not yet named in any structured way. Animals move without human domestication, and somewhere in this environment, humans are learning that flavor is not fixed. It can be adjusted, it can be improved, it can even be chosen, and that realization, small as it seems, is the first quiet step toward everything that will follow. You are still far from pepper being worth more than gold, far from caravans crossing deserts for cinnamon, far from ships chasing monsoon winds across oceans. But all of that is already implied in these early choices made by hands crushing seeds into stone bowls beside firelight. For now, there is only the simplest truth. Humans discover that nature does not just feed them. It can be asked to taste differently, and that question, once asked, never truly goes away. You move forward, and the world subtly changes its texture. The forests are still dense, the rivers still carve their patient paths through soil and stone. But human attention is no longer focused only on survival. Something quieter is happening now, a slow refinement of perception. People are no longer just eating what keeps them alive. They are beginning to notice what makes life feel different. Fire becomes your constant companion in this landscape, not as a tool alone, but as a kind of gathering point for memory. Around it, early communities sit in loose circles, sharing food that is increasingly shaped by small additions from the natural world, a crushed seed here, a bitter leaf there, a strip of bark that changes the warmth of a broth. Nothing is measured. Everything is learned through repetition. A widely accepted historical fact is that controlled use of fire for cooking significantly expanded human dietary possibilities, allowing tougher plant materials and meats to become digestible and safer. But what matters here is not only survival, it is what fire does to smell, to taste, to attention itself. It transforms raw ingredients into something that lingers in the air, something you can almost remember before you have even eaten it. You sit near one of these early fires. The smoke drifts upward in uneven streams, carrying fragments of whatever has been thrown into it. Some of those fragments are accidental, others are intentional. A handful of aromatic sesco, seeds cracked open on a flat stone, a root sliced and dropped into boiling water. Someone watches carefully, noticing which additions make people lean closer, which ones cause hesitation, which ones bring quiet satisfaction. A quirky anthropological observation suggests that early human groups often repeated successful flavor combinations long before understanding their chemical properties. Taste memory, not science, guided early culinary experimentation. A flavor that worked once was remembered, repeated, and gradually refined across generations. Historians still argue whether early seasoning practices developed primarily from medicinal experimentation or from purely culinary curiosity, because the evidence overlaps so heavily that separating the two motivations becomes nearly impossible. What heals and what tastes good often begin as the same discovery. You begin to notice that certain plants are no longer treated casually. They are gathered with intention, People know where to find them. They return to those places seasonally. Some of these plants are dried near fires. Others are stored in woven containers made from reeds or bark fibers. This is not agriculture yet, but it is the beginning of preservation. And preservation is the first step towards trade. In these early settlements, knowledge spreads slowly but reliably. A person learns that adding crushed seeds to a stew reduces bitterness. Another discovers that a particular bark eases stomach discomfort. These observations are shared not as formal knowledge, but as lived experience. You try it, you remember it, you pass it on, and slowly. Something begins to shift in how humans relate to plants. They are no longer only resources. They become partners in shaping experience. Certain plants are associated with warmth, others with clarity, others with relief from discomfort. These associations are not written anywhere, but they are deeply stored in collective behavior. A mainstream historical understanding is that many early medicinal practices were closely intertwined with food preparation, meaning that the boundary between spice and medicine was fluid for thousands of years. A single plant could be both nourishment and remedy depending on context and dosage. You move deeper into this world and notice how geography begins to matter more than it once did. Some regions are rich with aromatic plants, others are not. Some valleys produce bitter roots that become essential in local diets. Some forests offer resinous substances that burn with a sweet, lingering scent. Communities begin to recognize that what grows in one place is not guaranteed elsewhere. This awareness quietly plants the idea of value, not monetary value yet, but practical importance. A plant that exists only in a specific valley becomes something worth remembering, worth returning to, perhaps even worth exchanging with neighboring groups. You see early forms of movement across land, not caravans, not roads, but pathways worn into grass and soil by repeated travel. Groups carrying bundles of dried plants, simple tools, stone containers. These journeys are not yet commerce in the modern sense, but they are the earliest form of exchange networks forming between human groups. A quirky detail preserved in ethnobotanical studies suggests that some early societies deliberately cultivated semi-wild aromatic plants near seasonal camps, increasing their availability without fully domesticating them. It is a quiet transition between foraging and farming, shaped by convenience and preference. And in this transition, taste begins to stabilize. What was once accidental becomes expected. A certain flavor is no longer surprising. It is requested. It is remembered. It is desired again. You might not notice it at first, but desire is becoming structured. Humans are beginning to want specific sensory experiences, not just general nourishment. A bowl of food is no longer enough if it is only filling. It begins to matter how it feels to eat it, how it smells before it reaches the mouth, how it lingers afterward. Historians still argue whether this shift towards sensory preference was gradual or accelerated by environmental pressures, such as seasonal scarcity or competition between groups. What is clear is that once flavor becomes desirable in itself, it never returns to being purely functional. You follow this slow transformation through landscapes that remain quiet and natural, but internally, human experience is becoming more complex. The same seed that once simply fed a person now carries memory. It carries expectation. It carries comparison to other experiences. Firelight flickers again in your awareness. Around it, people are no longer only eating. They are talking, gesturing, reacting to taste in subtle ways. A nod of approval, a pause of curiosity, a shared recognition that something is better than it was before. And in that small recognition, the earliest form of culinary culture is born. You are still far from empires, still far from ships and caravans that will one day carry spices across continents. But the foundation is no longer invisible. It is forming in plain sight now, inside bowls of broth, inside the smoke of early fires, inside the quiet human decision to add just a little more of something fragrant to the food in front of them. That decision, repeated countless times across generations, is what will eventually shape entire worlds. You drift forward again and the landscape begins to open outward in ways that feel almost imperceptible at first. The forests are still present, still dense in places, but there are now edges where human movement has thinned them. Paths widen, camps become more stable, and something new appears in the rhythm of life. People are no longer only reacting to what the land provides. They are beginning to anticipate it. Fire remains central, but it is no longer just a gathering point. It is becoming a tool for transformation around it. Food is not simply cooked, it is composed. You notice that early humans are experimenting more deliberately with combinations of plants, roots, seeds, and resins. Some are crushed into pastes, others are steeped in water. Some are thrown directly into embers to release scent before being mixed into food. The act of preparing meals begins to carry intention beyond survival. A widely recognized historical fact is that early human migration patterns closely followed ecological zones rich in reliable food sources, which naturally included regions abundant in aromatic and medicinal plants. This movement is one of the earliest forces that spread flavor knowledge across vast distances. You find yourself walking alongside a small group moving through a transitional landscape between forest and open plain. They carry bundles wrapped in woven plant fibers. Inside are dried leaves, crushed seeds, and small hardened resins that catch light when exposed. These are not labeled or categorized, but each has meaning within the group. Each has a known effect on taste, on comfort, on the body. A quirky ethnographic observation suggests that in some prehistoric communities, aromatic plants were stored separately from other food items, indicating an early recognition of their distinct role beyond basic nutrition. Even without formal language for spice, there is already classification happening through practice. Historians still argue whether this separation of aromatic materials from staple foods represents the true beginning of spice consciousness, or whether it is simply an extension of medicinal storage habits. The boundary between healing and flavor remains blurred, almost deliberately so by nature itself. You notice how knowledge moves within the group. It is not written, it is performed. One person prepares food in a certain way, others observe. If the result is pleasing, it is remembered. If it is not, it is adjusted. Over time, these small adjustments accumulate into recognizable patterns. Certain combinations become stable, certain flavors become expected. The environment itself begins to play a different role in human attention. Plants are no longer just gathered randomly. People return to specific places where useful species are known to grow. Seasonal cycles are tracked not in calendars, but in memory. When a particular scent returns to the air, it signals that something important is ready again. A mainstream historical understanding is that pre-agricultural societies developed detailed ecological knowledge of their surroundings, including the seasonal availability of plants later identified as early spices. This knowledge was essential for survival and gradually became cultural memory. You move deeper into this rhythm and begin to sense the early shaping of exchange. Not yet formal trade, but something more fluid and personal. One group encounters another at the edge of a river or near a shared resource. They exchange not just objects, but techniques. A method of grinding seeds more effectively. A way of drying roots without losing aroma. A preparation that reduces bitterness in wild greens. These exchanges are quiet but transformative. They spread knowledge faster than migration alone. A taste discovered in one place begins to appear in another, carried not by institutions but by individuals remembering what they have learned. You begin to see how geography influences flavor identity. In colder regions, warming spices become more valued. In humid environments, bitter and cleansing plants gain importance. In dry landscapes, aromatic resins that survive long storage become essential. Each environment shapes a different palette of preference. A quirky archaeological insight suggests that residues of aromatic plant compounds found in ancient cooking sites often vary significantly by region, indicating localized traditions of seasoning long before large-scale trade networks existed. Historians still argue whether these regional flavor differences represent independent culinary invention or early forms of shared cultural diffusion. The evidence suggests both processes may have been occurring simultaneously, weaving complexity into something that appears simple on the surface. You pause with the group again as they make camp near water. Fire is lit. Stones are arranged. Food is prepared with practiced familiarity. But there is something different now in how they interact with it. There is anticipation. People expect certain sensations from certain meals. The surprise of raw survival is slowly being replaced by the comfort of repetition. Someone adds crushed seeds into a simmering pot. Another places a dried root near the edge of the fire to release its scent slowly. The air changes. Conversations quiet slightly. Attention narrows, even without language. There is shared recognition that something meaningful is happening in this moment. You realize that spice, in its earliest form, is not about intensity. It is about modulation. It changes not just flavor, but perception. It makes food feel warmer, deeper, sometimes more alive, and that effect begins to matter more than simple caloric value. A mainstream historical fact is that early human dietary expansion included a growing reliance on plant-based compounds that enhanced both preservation and palatability of food, contributing to increased group stability and survival efficiency. You continue forward through time and notice how memory becomes central to this evolution. Humans are not just reacting to taste anymore, they are remembering it. A flavor experienced once is sought again. A successful combination becomes part of group identity over generations. These memories accumulate into something that resembles tradition, and tradition begins quietly here, not as ritual, but as preference repeated often enough to feel natural. The landscape shifts once more as you move toward broader open regions. Movement increases. Groups are less isolated. Encounters become more frequent. And with each encounter, knowledge spreads further. A seed carried from one valley appears in another. A preparation method travels with a migrating group. A scent remembered in one place becomes desired in a distant one. Historians still argue whether the earliest spread of spice knowledge was driven more by environmental necessity or by social curiosity. But what is clear is that once humans began valuing flavor as experience rather than mere function, that value traveled faster than geography could contain it. You feel the foundation of something larger now. Not yet empires, not yet trade routes marked on maps, but a growing network of shared sensory understanding, built quietly through countless small moments of preparation, tasting and remembering, and in this slow accumulation of taste, you are witnessing the earliest architecture of what will one day become global spice culture. You move forward and the world begins to feel less like scattered human groups surviving in isolation and more like a connected rhythm slowly tightening across continents. Fire is still central, still flickering in the center of every settlement, but what surrounds it is changing. Food is no longer just prepared, it is being refined, categorized, remembered, and slowly elevated into something that carries identity. You notice the shift first in the air. It is not just smoke anymore. It is layered smoke. Wood, resin, crushed seeds, dried herbs, and unfamiliar aromatics all blending into a complexity that lingers longer than simple firelight should allow. Even before you taste anything, you can already sense that humans have begun to understand something profound. Flavor is no longer accidental. It is becoming intentional design. A well-established historical understanding shows that ancient civilizations across Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley developed early systems of recorded agriculture and food preparation, including the use of aromatic substances for both preservation and enhancement of meals. These early systems mark the beginning of structured culinary culture rather than instinctive survival cooking. You move into early river civilizations where settlement density increases dramatically. Life is no longer scattered. It is concentrated. Along these rivers, food production becomes more predictable, and with predictability comes experimentation. People are not just eating what they find, they're starting to decide what they want to create. In these environments, spices begin to take on layered roles. They are no longer just additives, they are modifiers of experience. A pinch of crushed seeds can change the entire emotional tone of a meal. A bitter bark can transform something heavy into something medicinally comforting. A resinous aroma can signal luxury even before the food is consumed. A lesser-known archaeological insight reveals that traces of aromatic plant use have been found in domestic cooking vessels predating formal written records, suggesting that seasoning practices were already embedded in daily life long before documentation began. You observe how knowledge now moves through structured communities. Unlike earlier wandering groups, these settlements store information more reliably. Techniques are passed within households, kitchens, and specialized roles. Certain individuals begin to gain reputations not as hunters or builders, but as people who understand preparation. They know how to balance bitterness with warmth, how to soften harshness with fragrance. There is no official word for this role yet, but the function already exists. You begin to notice something subtle happening in perception itself. Humans are no longer only reacting to hunger, they are anticipating pleasure. Meals are planned not just for nourishment but for experience, and spices become the bridge between necessity and enjoyment. A frequently discussed academic interpretation suggests that the development of early culinary seasoning was closely linked to medicinal experimentation, where plants used for healing gradually became integrated into everyday cooking practices. You walk through a bustling riverside settlement. Markets are beginning to form. Not yet formal marketplaces as you would imagine them, but clusters of exchange. People bring goods to shared spaces, grain, dried fish, woven materials, and increasingly, bundles of aromatic plants. These items are small, but they carry disproportionate value. Some are rare, some are seasonal. Some grow only in specific microclimates. That scarcity gives them weight far beyond their size. You notice how people react differently to these items. A handful of dried leaves might be treated with more care than a large bundle of grain. Not because it is more essential for survival, but because it transforms experience in ways survival alone cannot explain. A cultural observation often noted by anthropologists is that early societies tended to assign symbolic value to aromatic substances, treating them as offerings, status markers, or ritual enhancements, even when their practical use was still being discovered. You begin to see how trade, in its earliest form, is already emerging naturally from human difference. One region has something another region lacks. One valley produces aromatic resins, another produces bitter but healing roots. When groups meet, even briefly, exchange becomes inevitable, not organized, not standardized, but deeply human, and within that exchange, something begins to spread faster than objects themselves, knowledge. You watch as a preparation method travels from one settlement to another, a way of drying seeds without losing their fragrance, a technique for grinding bark into powder using stone surfaces, a method for balancing strong flavors so they do not overwhelm the dish. These are not written down. They are remembered through repetition and demonstration. And because they are tied to sensory experience, they're extremely difficult to forget. A widely accepted archaeological interpretation notes that early cultural diffusion often occurred through food practices, with shared preparation techniques serving as one of the most stable forms of knowledge transmission across migrating groups. You notice that taste is becoming a shared language, even without words. People recognize when something has been prepared well. There is agreement in reaction. even if there is no formal system to describe it. This shared recognition creates bonds between groups that otherwise might have remained separate. And that bond is powerful. It means that food is no longer just survival. It is communication. You pause again near a river where several groups have gathered. Firelight reflects off water. Conversations overlap. Goods are exchanged, and in the center of it all, small bundles of aromatic plants change hands carefully, almost ceremonially. Something is happening here that no one fully understands yet, but it is irreversible. A nuanced scholarly perspective proposes that early spice exchange networks may have formed not as deliberate trade systems, but as extensions of social interaction, gradually evolving into structured economic behavior over time. You can feel the shift now. Humans are beginning to value not just what keeps them alive, but what enhances how they live, and spices sit exactly at that intersection. They are not essential in the strictest sense, but once experienced, they feel essential anyway, and that is where everything begins to accelerate. Because once humans learn that flavour can be chosen, improved and shared, they also learn that it can be sought, and what is sought will eventually be travelled for. You move forward again, and the world no longer feels like isolated pockets of human life scattered across wild landscapes. Something broader is forming now, something that feels like invisible threads stretching between distant places. Rivers still guide settlements, forests still dominate the horizon, but movement has increased. People are no longer only anchored to where they are born. They are beginning to drift, travel, return, and exchange. Fire remains at the center of daily life, but its meaning has expanded. It is no longer just survival or comfort, it is now a place where information is tested. Around it, food is not only cooked but compared. One group notices that a certain crushed seed reduces bitterness in wild greens. Another discovers that a dried root softens the harshness of river fish. These small observations accumulate, and slowly, they begin to travel farther than the people who discovered them. A widely accepted historical understanding is that early human societies increasingly relied on seasonal movement and ecological knowledge to locate food resources, creating early patterns of migration that unintentionally spread botanical and culinary knowledge across large regions. You find yourself following one of these early movement paths. It is not a road, it is a memory carved into the land through repeated footsteps. The ground is uneven, shaped by generations of passage along this route. Different groups occasionally meet at predictable points such as river crossings, sheltered valleys, or seasonal resource zones. These encounters are brief but meaningful. In these meetings, exchange happens naturally, not in a structured or formal sense, but through observation and curiosity. One group shows another how they prepare a certain plant. Another shares a method for preserving meat using aromatic smoke. A third demonstrates how to reduce bitterness in certain roots by soaking them in water before cooking. Each interaction adds a layer to collective knowledge. A lesser-known anthropological observation suggests that early exchange networks were often maintained through repeated seasonal gatherings rather than continuous contact, creating cyclical rather than constant flows of goods and information. Historians still debate whether these early exchanges were primarily driven by necessity during scarcity, or by social curiosity and the human tendency to seek novelty. Evidence suggests both forces likely operated at the same time, reinforcing each other over generations. You notice that certain plants begin to appear in multiple regions that do not naturally share the same environment. This is the earliest hint of movement beyond ecological boundaries. Aromatic substances are particularly suited for this kind of travel. They are lightweight, durable when dried, and intensely memorable even in small quantities. A pinch of something can carry the identity of an entire region, and because of this, spices begin to behave differently from other resources. You enter a settlement near a river junction where multiple groups converge. The atmosphere is different here, more layered, more dynamic. There is constant arrival and departure. Goods are exchanged, but so are stories. People speak of distant valleys where certain plants grow in abundance. Others describe forests where specific aromatic resins are collected from tree bark during dry seasons. A cultural insight frequently noted by archaeologists is that early human gatherings often functioned as combined economic, social, and informational hubs, where knowledge transfer was as important as material exchange. You begin to see how value is slowly shifting. At first, value was purely survival-based. Food, water, shelter. Then it became functional improvement now. Something new is emerging. Sensory value. The ability of a substance to change experience is becoming important in itself. A bitter root is no longer just a plant, it is something that can be transformed into comfort. A pungent seed is no longer just a wild resource. It is something that can define the character of a meal. A fragrant resin is no longer just tree excretion. It is atmosphere, mood, even memory. You walk through a gathering space where food is being prepared collectively. The process is slower here than in earlier scenes. More deliberate. Stones are used to grind seeds. Leaves are dried and crushed. Small portions are added carefully, not randomly. People observe reactions closely. Taste becomes a shared experiment. A widely recognized archaeological interpretation indicates that early culinary practices evolved through communal experimentation, where food preparation was often a group activity that refined techniques through repeated trial and shared feedback. You notice how people react to successful combinations. There is subtle approval, a nod, a pause of appreciation. These reactions are important. They reinforce memory, they guide repetition, and repetition is what transforms experimentation into tradition. In the background of this, movement continues, groups leave the settlement carrying bundles of goods, others arrive carrying unfamiliar materials. Each arrival brings the possibility of new flavor knowledge. Each departure carries something learned forward into unknown regions. And this is where something crucial begins to form. Spices are no longer just local discoveries. They are becoming transferable identity markers. A region can now be recognized by the flavors it produces or prefers, even without formal language. Taste begins to encode geography. A nuanced scholarly perspective suggests that early spice diffusion was less about centralized trade systems and more about decentralized human mobility, where small groups acted as carriers of both material goods and sensory knowledge. You continue following the rhythm of these movements. The landscape is vast, but not empty. It is filled with invisible connections forming between groups who may never meet directly, but still influence each other through what they carry. A seed from one valley appears in another. A preparation technique travels across mountain passes. A method of preserving aromatic bark spreads along river routes. None of this is organized, but all of it is persistent. And within this persistence, something begins to resemble structure. Not yet empires, not yet markets, but networks. You pause at a moment of quiet near the river again. Smoke rises from multiple small fires. Conversations overlap in different tones and rhythms. Somewhere in the middle of it all, someone crushes seeds into a stone bowl and adds them to a simmering mixture. The smell changes immediately. Others notice. They lean slightly closer. That moment of shared attention is important. It is how knowledge stabilizes, not through writing, not through authority, but through recognition. A mainstream historical fact is that long before formal trade routes existed, human societies were already engaged in extensive exchange systems that included goods, techniques, and environmental knowledge passed between migrating and neighboring groups. You feel the scale of what is forming here. It is not dramatic, it is not sudden, it is incremental, but it is irreversible. Humans are building a world where flavor can move independently of geography, where experience can be carried, where taste becomes portable. And once something becomes portable, it begins to travel farther than its origin ever intended. The river continues to flow beside you. People continue to move along its edges. Fires continue to burn in small clusters of light. And in each of these places, something small and aromatic is being tested, remembered, and passed forward. It is still simple, still fragile, but already it is everywhere at once, quietly shaping the future without announcing itself. And you realize that spices are not just ingredients, they are movement made visible. You move forward again, and the rhythm of human life shifts in a way that feels almost invisible at first, like a change in wind direction that you only notice after it has already altered the landscape. Settlements are still rooted along rivers and fertile corridors, but now they feel less isolated. There is a growing sense that no place exists entirely on its own anymore. Everything is beginning to touch something else, even across great distances. Fire still anchors daily life, but it is no longer just a centre for survival or social gathering. It is becoming a stage where experimentation quietly unfolds. People are no longer satisfied with simply repeating what works. They are refining, adjusting, and comparing outcomes. A handful of crushed seeds might be slightly more aromatic in one preparation than another. A dried root might preserve better when exposed to smoke rather than sun. These observations are small, but they accumulate like sediment over time. A widely recognized historical understanding shows that the emergence of complex river-based civilizations in regions such as Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley created stable agricultural surpluses, which allowed societies to invest more time in refining food preparation techniques, including the early systematic use of aromatic plants. You begin to follow the flow of one such river civilization. The environment is structured now in a different way. Fields stretch outward in organized patterns. Storage spaces appear within settlements. There is a clearer division between cultivated land and wild land, and within this structure, something subtle begins to happen. Certain plants that were once gathered casually from the wild are now being protected, encouraged, or even selectively grown near settlements. A lesser-known archaeological insight suggests that early communities may have begun managing semi-wild aromatic plants near habitation zones long before full domestication occurred, creating transitional landscapes between foraging and agriculture. Historians still debate whether this early plant management represents intentional cultivation or simply repeated harvesting that gradually shaped plant distribution over time. The boundary between human intention and ecological adaptation remains difficult to define in these early stages. You notice how food preparation becomes more structured in these settlements. There are designated areas where cooking happens. Stones are arranged for grinding. Storage containers are used more consistently. Ingredients are grouped not only by type but by function. Some are for nourishment, others are for preservation. And a small but increasingly important category begins to emerge for enhancement of flavour. This is where spices begin to separate themselves conceptually from other plant materials. You move through a busy riverside settlement. The air is layered with competing aromas, grain cooking over open flames, fish drying near smoke, fermented mixtures stored in clay containers, and beneath it all, subtle notes of crushed seeds and aromatic bark being used in controlled amounts to modify flavour. A cultural observation frequently noted by anthropologists is that early urbanised settlements often developed specialised roles related to food preparation, including individuals who focused specifically on blending and enhancing flavours, even before formal culinary professions existed. You watch one of these early preparation spaces more closely. A person grinds seeds on a flat stone with steady, practiced motion. The texture becomes finer with each pass. Nearby, another person prepares a liquid mixture infused with dried plant material. Nothing is measured precisely, but everything is intentional. Experience guides proportion. The results are shared among a small group. Reactions are immediate and subtle. A slight pause, a change in expression, a quiet acknowledgement that something has improved. These responses matter more than any formal instruction. They determine whether a method will be repeated or forgotten. A widely accepted archaeological interpretation suggests that early culinary knowledge was transmitted primarily through observation and repetition within household and community settings, rather than through formal instruction or documentation. You begin to see how exchange expands beyond physical goods. It is no longer just seeds, resins, or dried roots moving between groups. It is also techniques, preferences, and sensory expectations. One group learns that a certain combination of plants creates warmth in the body. Another discovers that a particular preparation reduces spoilage during transport. These insights begin to travel with people as they move between regions, and movement is increasing. You follow paths that now feel more established than before. They are not roads in any modern sense, but they are no longer random either. Repeated use has created recognizable routes. Along these routes, temporary gathering points emerge where groups meet seasonally or opportunistically. These locations become hubs of exchange. A nuanced scholarly perspective proposes that early exchange systems were often structured around environmental predictability, such as seasonal harvest cycles and migratory patterns, rather than centralized planning. At these gathering points, you notice something important happening. People are not only exchanging materials, they are comparing experiences. One group describes a flavor that another group has never encountered. A certain aromatic resin that produces warmth and clarity when burned. A seed that transforms bitterness into depth. A root that carries a lingering sweetness when cooked slowly. These descriptions create curiosity, and curiosity drives movement. You see individuals choosing to travel further than they normally would in order to acquire specific materials they have only heard about. This is the beginning of desire extending beyond immediate necessity. A mainstream historical fact is that early interregional trade networks gradually developed through repeated cycles of seasonal exchange, allowing goods and knowledge to spread across increasingly large geographic areas over time. You pause in a settlement where multiple groups have converged. The atmosphere is dense with interaction. Goods are laid out for exchange. Conversations overlap. Children observe adults negotiating silently through gesture and offering. And in the middle of this, small bundles of aromatic plants are carefully displayed and evaluated. These items are treated differently from heavier goods. They are smaller, more delicate, but clearly significant. People handle them with attention, sometimes even reverence. Not because they are rare in the abstract sense, but because they are known to transform experience in ways that cannot be easily replaced. A quirky archaeological observation suggests that in some early settlements, aromatic materials were stored in specially designated containers separate from other food supplies, indicating an early awareness of their distinct sensory and cultural value. You begin to understand how value is evolving. It is no longer tied only to survival or quantity, it is increasingly tied to transformation. What can this object do to perception? How does it change the experience of living? Spices, even in these early forms, are becoming central to that question. You move through the crowd and notice how knowledge spreads informally. A preparation method observed in one corner of the gathering space is quickly repeated elsewhere. Someone watches, learns, and adapts it immediately. There is no need for formal instruction. The environment itself acts as a learning system. And because of this, change spreads quickly. A new combination of ingredients can move through multiple groups within a single season. A successful preparation method can appear in distant settlements within a few cycles of travel. Information is not static, it is fluid, carried by people who are constantly moving between places. Historians still debate whether the speed of early culinary diffusion was primarily driven by human migration or by repeated convergence at shared seasonal hubs. But most evidence suggests that both mechanisms reinforced each other. You step back slightly from the settlement and look at the broader landscape again. Rivers continue to guide movement, fields expand slowly. Fields expand. Forests retreat in certain areas, and across all of it. Human activity creates invisible lines of connection. Some of those lines are practical, some are cultural, and some are sensory. Taste itself is becoming one of the strongest connectors between distant groups. Because once a flavor is experienced, it creates memory. And once memory exists, absence becomes noticeable. That absence is what drives travel. And travel is what turns small aromatic plants into something far larger than their physical size suggests. You feel the system beginning to form now, not as a design structure, but as an emergent one, built from repetition, from curiosity, from shared experience, and at the center of it all, quietly shaping every interaction, is the simple human decision to make food taste a little different than it did before. You move forward again, and the world feels denser, more structured, as if human life has begun to compress itself into defined spaces rather than spread loosely across open landscapes. Settlements are larger now, activity is more constant, and time itself feels more organized, measured less by survival urgency and more by routine. Fire remains at the center of everything, but its role has changed. It is no longer only about warmth or safety. It has become a controlled instrument. Cooking is more deliberate, meals are more consistent, and most importantly, flavor is no longer something that happens by chance. It is something people expect to reproduce. You walk through early urbanizing settlements where food production and preparation are no longer purely household activities. There are shared spaces where grains are processed, where liquids are brewed, where meats are preserved, and within these spaces, aromatic plants begin to take on a more defined role. They are not used randomly anymore. They are selected, combined, and adjusted. A broadly accepted historical view holds that the rise of early complex societies led to the specialization of labor, including the separation of food production, cooking, and trade-related activities, which allowed more sophisticated culinary practices to develop over time. You notice how certain individuals within these settlements begin to gain reputations not for hunting or building, but for their knowledge of taste. They understand which combinations soften harsh flavors, which ingredients extend shelf life, and which subtle additions create balance in otherwise simple meals. Their knowledge is not written down, but it is respected. In these environments, spices begin to gain a slightly different identity. They are no longer just gathered items from the wild. They are increasingly seen as deliberate enhancements. A small amount of crushed aromatic seed can transform an entire communal meal. A dried bark infusion can make stored grains feel newly palatable after long periods of storage. A lesser-known archaeological finding indicates that residues of aromatic plant compounds appear more frequently in communal cooking vessels than in individual household containers, suggesting early collective experimentation with flavor enhancement. You move through markets that are becoming more organized, not yet formalized in the modern sense, but clearly structured. Goods are grouped, exchange points are consistent, and within these exchanges, aromatic materials occupy a special category. They are small in volume but high in attention value. People do not handle them casually. There is care in how they are measured, how they are divided, how they are traded, even without formal currency. These items carry disproportionate importance in exchange interaction. You notice that spices are beginning to act like social connectors. A group that possesses a rare aromatic resin may find themselves visited more frequently by neighboring groups. Knowledge, materials, and people circulate more actively around them. A cultural insight often highlighted by anthropologists is that early trade systems frequently valued items not only for practical utility, but also for their role in facilitating social interaction and reinforcing intergroup relationships. You pause near a cooking area where several people are preparing food together. The process is layered. One person grinds seeds into a fine powder. Another mixes dried leaves into a simmering liquid. A third adjusts the mixture based on smell rather than measurement. The air becomes increasingly complex with overlapping scents. What is striking here was not just the use of spices, but the awareness of their effects. People are no longer surprised when flavor changes. They are expecting it. They are shaping it. And that expectation is powerful. A widely discussed academic interpretation suggests that the development of structured culinary practices was closely tied to the human ability to remember sensory experiences and intentionally recreate them in future contexts. You begin to see how knowledge now spreads through repetition at scale. A successful flavor combination in one household is quickly observed by others. It is copied, adapted, and refined. Over time, entire settlements begin to share recognizable taste profiles. Even without centralized instruction, this is not uniformity. It is convergence through imitation and adaptation. You follow movement through connecting pathways between settlements. These routes are more defined now. Repeated travel has created recognizable corridors of exchange. Along these corridors, goods and knowledge move together. A traveller carries not only materials but also methods, preferences, and sensory expectations. A nuanced scholarly interpretation proposes that early interregional exchange was driven as much by experiential knowledge transfer as by material necessity, with taste preferences playing a key role in motivating long-distance movement. You arrive at a larger gathering point where multiple groups converge. The environment is active, layered with sound and motion. Goods are exchanged openly. Conversations overlap, and in the center of it all, aromatic materials are once again treated with special attention. You notice how they are evaluated, not just by appearance but by scent. People lean closer, they compare, they recall previous experiences. A certain aroma might remind someone of a distant valley. Another might be associated with comfort or healing. These associations influence value in subtle but powerful ways. A well-documented archaeological interpretation notes that sensory memory likely played a significant role in early valuation systems, particularly for lightweight and highly aromatic materials that could be transported easily across regions. You step back slightly and observe how information spreads in this environment. Someone learns a preparation technique and demonstrates it nearby. Others watch and replicate it immediately. There is no delay between learning and adoption. The system is highly responsive, and because of this, change accelerates. A new seasoning method can move through multiple groups within a single gathering cycle. A successful preservation technique can become widespread across regions in a short period of time. Knowledge behaves almost like a living current, flowing through human interaction. Historians still disagree on whether this rapid diffusion of culinary knowledge was primarily driven by necessity during seasonal scarcity, or by the intrinsic human attraction to novelty and sensory diversity. Though most evidence suggests both forces reinforced each other, you notice something important emerging beneath all of this activity. Taste is becoming a shared reference point. Even without common language, people can agree on what is pleasant, what is strong, what is balanced. This shared sensory understanding creates a form of communication that does not rely on words. It builds trust, and trust allows exchange to deepen. You begin to see how spices are slowly becoming more than ingredients. They are becoming markers of connection between groups. A certain flavor might signal origin. A particular aroma might indicate preparation skill or regional identity. These subtle cues begin to matter more than simple quantity. A quirky ethnographic observation suggests that in some early communities, aromatic substances were sometimes used in ritualized exchange settings, where their presentation carried symbolic meaning beyond their practical use in cooking. You move through the settlement one final time in this section, and notice how everything feels slightly more interconnected than before. Nothing exists in isolation. Every group is linked to another through movement, memory, or shared experience. And at the center of these connections, quietly shaping behavior, is flavor, not yet formalized, not yet commodified in the way later civilizations will define it, but already powerful enough to guide movement, influence interaction, and shape early systems of exchange. You realize that spices are no longer just something humans find, they are something humans now seek, and that changes everything that comes next. You move forward again, and the world begins to feel tighter, more economically charged, as if invisible pressure has been added to everything humans do. Settlements are larger now, and movement between them is no longer occasional or seasonal alone. It is increasingly continuous. People are travelling with clearer purpose, carrying goods not just for survival, but for exchange that now has recognisable value structures. Fire still anchors domestic life, but it is now surrounded by more specialised activity. Cooking is no longer simply a shared necessity. It is becoming a skill that can be refined, taught, and even compared. Certain individuals are recognised for their ability to transform basic ingredients into something consistently desirable. And at the centre of this transformation, spices are beginning to take on a new identity. A widely acknowledged historical understanding indicates that as early state-level societies formed, economic systems became more formalised, including standardised trade in goods that were small in size but high in perceived value, such as aromatic substances used for flavour, preservation, and ritual purposes. You find yourself in a dense network of early trade routes where movement is constant, not chaotic, but patterned. Caravans are forming more regularly, goods are being sorted more deliberately, and among all items in circulation, aromatic materials stand out because of their unique combination of properties. They are lightweight, durable, and intensely memorable. A small quantity can change the character of food, ceremony, or even social interaction. You begin to notice how pepper, in its early forms, becomes particularly important in these exchanges. Not because it is the only valuable spice, but because it carries a strong and unmistakable sensory impact. It is sharp, warming, and persistent. Even a small amount transforms otherwise simple meals into something more complex and noticeable. A lesser-known archaeological insight suggests that residues of pepper and similar aromatic seeds have been identified in ancient storage vessels far from their original growing regions, indicating early long-distance movement of spice materials well before fully developed trade empires existed. You move through a growing settlement where exchange activity is becoming more structured. There are designated spaces where goods are brought, evaluated, and exchanged. While there is no unified currency system yet, certain items begin to function as reference points of value. Aromatic substances increasingly fall into this category. People do not question their importance anymore. They assume it. You watch a smaller exchange take place. A bundle of dried grain is offered in return for a smaller quantity of aromatic seeds. The exchange feels unequal in physical size, but balanced in perceived value. That imbalance is important. It signals a shift away from quantity-based exchange toward experience-based valuation. A cultural observation frequently discussed in anthropological studies is that early trade systems often elevated certain sensory goods into quasi-standardized exchange items due to their portability, rarity, and emotional impact on consumption experiences. You begin to see how this changes human behavior. People are willing to travel further for smaller objects if those objects significantly alter experience. A spice that improves flavour is no longer just a plant product. It becomes something worth effort, negotiation, and sometimes risk. And with that, distance itself becomes less of a barrier. You follow movement along a more defined trade corridor. This is not a road in the modern sense, but it is clearly shaped by repeated use. Paths are worn into the landscape, resting points appear at regular intervals, Small clusters of activity form where groups pause, exchange, and continue onward. Along these routes, spices move alongside other goods, but they carry a different kind of attention. They're often stored carefully, separated from heavier items, protected from moisture or contamination. Their value is not in bulk, but in effect. A mainstream historical fact shows that early trade networks connecting regions such as South Asia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean gradually expanded through overlapping land and sea routes, facilitating the movement of luxury goods including spices, textiles, and metals. You pause at a gathering point where multiple groups intersect. The atmosphere is layered with negotiation. Goods are displayed, comparisons are made, and in the middle of this exchange, aromatic materials are handled with particular care. People lean closer to evaluate them, not just visually but through scent memory. This is important. Value is no longer purely external, it is internalized. People remember how something felt when consumed before deciding its worth now. You notice that pepper and similar spices are beginning to function almost like social connectors. A household that possesses them gains subtle influence in exchange interactions. A travelling group carrying rare aromatic goods is welcomed differently than one carrying only staple materials. A nuanced scholarly interpretation proposes that early spice trade dynamics were shaped as much by social signalling and prestige as by practical culinary use, with aromatic substances functioning as indicators of access to distant networks. You move deeper into this system and observe how knowledge spreads alongside goods. A preparation method discovered in one region travels with the spice itself. A technique for preserving flavour during long transport becomes shared knowledge among traders. Even the understanding of how much to use becomes standardised over time. This is not coordinated, it is emergent. You watch as someone demonstrates a method of grinding pepper-like seeds into a finer consistency before mixing them into food. Others observe carefully. The result is improved distribution of flavour. That improvement is remembered and repeated. A well-recognised archaeological interpretation suggests that culinary refinement in early civilizations often emerged from iterative experimentation within trade-linked communities rather than isolated invention. Allowing techniques to spread rapidly across interconnected regions, you begin to see how economic behaviour is changing human attention. People are now thinking in terms of return, not only material return, but experiential return. If a small quantity of spice produces a significant change in food quality, it is considered worth the effort of acquisition. This is where value becomes abstract. You move through a bustling early marketplace where multiple forms of exchange are happening simultaneously. Grain, livestock, textiles, tools, and aromatic substances all circulate in overlapping patterns. But spices occupy a distinct psychological space. They are not essential for survival, yet they are increasingly difficult to ignore. A quirky ethnographic observation suggests that in some early societies, spices were sometimes stored in specially designated containers or elevated spaces within households, indicating a perception of symbolic or elevated status beyond ordinary food items. You notice that this perception affects behaviour. People discuss spices differently from other goods. They describe their effects, their origins, their intensity. They compare experiences rather than quantities. This creates a shared language of sensory value that transcends simple measurement. And through this language, trade becomes more than exchange, it becomes communication. You observe a merchant group preparing to travel along a longer route, their cargoes carefully arranged. Among heavier goods, small containers of aromatic substances are secured with extra attention. These items are clearly not the bulk of their load, but they may determine the success of their journey, because where they are going, demand for these items is high. A widely discussed academic perspective note that early long-distance trade often relied on high value, low-weight commodities to justify the risks and effort of travel, with spices becoming one of the earliest categories to fulfill this economic function. You feel the structure of something larger emerging now. Routes are becoming more consistent, exchange points are more predictable. Certain regions have become known for producing or distributing specific aromatic goods, even without formal maps. People begin to understand the geography of flavour. Pepper from one region, resin from another, seeds from a distant valley, each carries identity. Even before labels exist and that identity begins to matter, you step back and see the broader pattern. Human movement is increasingly shaped by sensory desire. People travel not just for survival needs, but for enhancement of experience. Flavour becomes a motivator for distance. Aroma becomes a reason for risk. Historians still debate whether the rise of early spice-centered trade was driven more by elite consumption patterns or by widespread cultural appreciation of flavor enhancement, though most evidence suggests a gradual expansion from elite use to broader societal adoption. You stand at the edge of this expanding network and realize something important. The world is no longer defined only by geography or survival constraints. It is increasingly defined by connection through taste. And spices are at the center of that connection, not as background detail, but as driving force. Small, portable, powerful enough to reshape how humans move through the world. You move forward again, and the world begins to feel less like scattered routes of exchange and more like an interlocking system that is slowly tightening across seas and land. Movement is no longer occasional or uncertain, it is increasingly structured. Even if no single authority has designed it. People know where to go, they know what to bring, and they increasingly know what others will expect in return. Fire remains at the centre of daily life, but its role has become almost architectural. Kitchens, hearths, and communal cooking spaces are now permanent features of settlements. Food preparation is no longer improvised around survival needs, it is planned. And within that planning, spices are no longer optional curiosities. They are becoming essential components of status, preservation, and identity. A widely recognized historical understanding of early Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations shows that expanding urban centers develop complex systems of long-distance exchange, where luxury commodities such as aromatic spices were integrated into elite diets. Religious offerings and medicinal practices. You find yourself drifting into a coastal city where stone, wood, and water converge into constant motion. Ships arrive and depart with regular rhythm. Warehouses line the shore. Goods are recorded, sorted, and redistributed inland. This is not yet a modern port system, but it is already structured enough that movement feels predictable rather than accidental. Among all the goods flowing through this system, spices occupy a uniquely concentrated role. They are small, easily transported, and disproportionately valued. A single container can represent the effort of weeks of travel, and because of that, they are treated with exceptional care. You notice how pepper, cinnamon, and similar aromatic substances begin to circulate not just as ingredients, but as markers of access. Who has them, how much they have, and where they came from all begin to matter socially. A lesser-known archaeological observation indicates that residues of exotic aromatic substances have been found in elite burial sites across multiple early civilizations, suggesting that spices were already associated with status, ritual significance, and symbolic wealth. You move deeper into the city's commercial district. The air is layered with competing scents. Fish drying in the sun, grain being milled, resin burning in small ritual spaces, and beneath it all, faint traces of imported aromatics that have travelled long distances before arriving here. Markets are more organised now, stalls are grouped, goods are categorised, and certain traders specialise almost exclusively in high-value, low-weight items. Among them, spices are the most important category. They are not just sold, they are evaluated, compared, and discussed. A cultural insight frequently noted in anthropological studies is that early urban marketplaces often developed informal systems of quality assessment based on sensory experience. particularly smell and taste, which allowed buyers to distinguish between different origins and grades of aromatic goods. You watch a transaction unfold. A small quantity of pepper is exchanged for a larger volume of grain. The exchange is not about volume equivalence, it is about perceived transformation. The pepper changes how food will be experienced. That change is valued more than physical quantity. This is where economic thinking begins to shift. Value is no longer purely tied to survival efficiency. It is tied to enhancement of life experience. You begin to see how this changes movement across regions. Traders are no longer traveling just to acquire necessities. They are traveling to acquire difference. A spice from a distant land is not just useful, it is novel. It is desirable because it is unfamiliar. A mainstream historical fact shows that early maritime trade routes in regions such as the Indian Ocean gradually developed into stable networks connecting East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, South Asia, and beyond, enabling the consistent movement of luxury goods including spices. You follow one of these maritime paths mentally, watching ships move with seasonal winds. The timing of travel is not random. It is synchronized with environmental cycles. Monsoon patterns determine when ships leave and when they return. This rhythm creates predictable windows of exchange. Spices are perfectly suited for this system. They store well, they resist spoilage, and they retain their sensory impact over long journeys. A small cargo can survive months at sea and still carry its full aromatic identity upon arrival. A quirky archaeological detail suggests that ancient storage methods for spices often included tightly sealed containers and layered packaging materials designed specifically to preserve aroma during long-distance transport. You move back into the city and notice how spices begin to influence daily life beyond timber and trade. They appear in food preparation more consistently now, not just in elite households, but increasingly in broader consumption contexts. Even simple meals are sometimes enhanced with small amounts of imported aromatics. This is important. It signals diffusion from elite use to wider cultural adoption. Historians still debate whether the early expansion of spice usage across social classes was driven primarily by imitation of elite culinary practices or by gradual increases in availability through expanding trade networks. Though both processes likely reinforced each other, you observe how this diffusion changes perception. People begin to associate certain flavors with quality. A meal without aromatic enhancement feels incomplete in some contexts, not because it is insufficient for survival, but because it lacks sensory depth that has become culturally familiar. And familiarity is powerful. You walk through domestic spaces where food preparation is now a daily ritual of adjustment and refinement. Ingredients are no longer combined randomly. There is intention behind proportions. Small quantities of aromatic substances are added with care. Too much overwhelms, too little disappears. Balance becomes important. A well-documented archaeological interpretation suggests that early culinary systems increasingly emphasize balance and proportion in flavor construction, reflecting a growing sophistication in food culture within urbanized societies. You notice that knowledge of spices is no longer isolated. It is shared across households, markets, and traveling groups. A merchant returning from a long journey brings not just goods, but stories of how those goods are used elsewhere. A technique learned in one region is introduced into another over time. This creates subtle convergence in taste preferences across distant areas. This is not uniformity, it is alignment through repetition. You continue through the commercial districts and see how specialization deepens. Some traders focus only on transport, others on storage, others on evaluation of quality, and among them, spice traders begin to form a distinct category. They understand origin, quality variation, and market demand across regions. A nuanced scholarly interpretation proposes that early specialization in trade roles was a key factor in the stabilization of long-distance exchange systems. allowing complex goods like spices to circulate more efficiently across large geographic networks. You begin to see how geography is no longer just physical, it is informational. People understand where things come from, even if they have never been there. Spice origins become part of collective awareness. Certain regions become associated with specific aromas, even in places far away. Pepper is not just pepper. It is pepper from somewhere specific. Cinnamon is not just cinnamon. It carries identity through distance, and that identity becomes part of its value. You pause near a harbour where ships are being loaded for departure. Crates are stacked carefully among heavier goods. Small containers of aromatic substances are placed in secure positions. They are clearly treated differently, not because they are fragile in a physical sense, but because they are sensitive in value terms. A widely recognized historical fact indicates that luxury goods, including spices, played a central role in sustaining early long-distance trade economies, as their high value relative to weight made them ideal for maritime and caravan-based transport systems. You watch as a ship prepares to leave. The wind shifts slightly. Sails adjust. The vessel moves slowly away from shore, carrying goods that will eventually reshape distant tables, rituals, and kitchens. And what is most striking is how small the cargo actually is. A handful of containers, a few bundles, yet within them lies the ability to change taste, to influence desire, to shape cultural habits far beyond this coastline. You realize that spices are now fully part of a globalizing system. Even if the word global does not yet exist, they are no longer just discovered, they are now expected. An expectation is what turns movement into system. You move forward again, and the world opens outward in a way that feels both deliberate and inevitable. The coastal cities you observed earlier are no longer isolated points of exchange. They are beginning to form a chain, connected not by visible infrastructure, but by repeated movement, shared knowledge, and the growing expectation that goods will travel. Fire still anchors domestic life, but its meaning is now deeply tied to commerce. Cooking is no longer just preparation of meals, it is part of a broader system of preservation. Presentation and exchange. Food must now survive travel, retain appeal across distance, and sometimes even improve with time when infused with aromatic substances. Spices become essential in that transformation. You find yourself stepping onto a harbour at the edge of a growing maritime world. Ships are no longer rare or experimental. They are becoming routine instruments of connection. Their hulls are shaped for longer journeys. Their crews understand seasonal winds. Their cargo reflects a new reality. The world is beginning to be treated as something traversable. A well-established historical perspective recognizes that early maritime expansion along the eastern coast of Africa and across the Indian Ocean was driven by predictable wind systems, particularly monsoon cycles, which enabled regular seasonal navigation between distant coastal regions. You watch as a vessel prepares to leave. It is not a grand ship by later standards, but it is purposeful, its cargoes carefully arranged, grain, textiles, ceramics, and most carefully of all, small containers of aromatic goods. These are stored with attention disproportionate to their size. They are not bulky, but they are irreplaceable in value. Pepper, dried roots, resinous fragments, and fragrant seeds are now part of this maritime logic. They are light enough to transport easily, yet powerful enough in effect to define entire trade relationships. A lesser-known archaeological interpretation suggests that spice residues found in coastal archaeological sites often appear alongside maritime storage materials, indicating that these goods were already deeply integrated into early seaborne exchange systems. You move with the ship as it leaves the harbour. The land recedes, the water expands, and with it, the sense of distance begins to change. Oceans are no longer absolute barriers. They are routes with timing, rhythm, and knowledge embedded in their movement. This is where a new kind of expertise emerges. Navigation becomes specialized. reading winds, currents, and seasonal patterns becomes essential. And alongside this technical knowledge, something quieter travels information about where spices are found, how they are valued, and how they are used in distant places. A cultural observation frequently noted by historians of trade systems is that maritime communities often became hubs of both logistical knowledge and culinary exchange, as sailors and merchants carried not only goods, but also sensory experiences between regions. You begin to see how spices function within this system. They are not just commodities, they are portable experiences. A taste experienced in one region can now be reproduced in another, even if the source is thousands of kilometers away. This creates a subtle but powerful psychological shift. Distance no longer prevents familiarity, and familiarity begins to shape demand. You arrive in a bustling port on another coastline. The environment is layered with foreign and local influences blending into a single sensory field. Goods are unloaded, sorted, and redistributed inland. Among them, spices attract particular attention. Traders inspect them closely, not just for quantity, but for aroma intensity and preservation quality. A widely acknowledged historical understanding of early Indian Ocean commerce highlights that spice-producing regions of South and Southeast Asia became central nodes in long-distance trade networks, supplying highly valued aromatic commodities to markets across the Middle East and Mediterranean worlds. You walk through the marketplace of this port city. It is larger, more complex, and more diverse than earlier settlements. Languages overlap. Goods from distant regions sit side by side, and in this environment, spices stand out because they connect otherwise unrelated systems of production and consumption. Pepper is not just an ingredient here, it is a reference point, a way of comparing value across different origins. A small measure can represent significant economic weight. You notice how traders discuss them, not only in terms of price, but in terms of quality differences tied to origin. Where it was grown matters, how it was dried matters. Even the route it travelled begins to influence perception. A nuanced scholarly interpretation proposes that early spice valuation systems were influenced by both material quality and perceived authenticity of origin, creating one of the earliest forms of geographically linked branding in global trade. You pause near a storage facility where goods are being organised for further transport inland. Spices are kept in sealed containers, separated from bulk commodities. This separation reflects not fragility in a physical sense, but recognition of their sensitivity in economic and sensory terms. Even slight changes in aroma can affect perceived value. You begin to understand how deeply perception now shapes exchange. Value is not fixed, it is experienced, and spices exist at the centre of that experiential economy. A quirky historical detail observed in archaeological findings suggests that some ancient storage containers for spices were designed specifically to minimise scent loss, indicating an early understanding of the importance of preserving aroma as a form of economic value. You continue through the city and notice how spice use is spreading beyond trade contexts. It is entering domestic life more broadly. Not only elite households, but increasingly wider segments of society are incorporating aromatic substances into food preparation. The distinction between luxury and everyday begins to blur slightly. This shift is gradual but significant. It indicates diffusion of taste culture. Historians still debate whether the broader adoption of spices across social strata was driven primarily by increased availability through expanding trade networks, or by aspirational imitation of elite culinary practices. Though most evidence suggests a combination of both dynamics. You observe a household preparing food in a modest courtyard. The process is careful but not extravagant. A small amount of aromatic powder is added to a simmering pot. The effect is immediate. The air changes. The food takes on depth that was not present before. People respond subtly. A pause, a slight acknowledgement, a sense that the meal has become more complete. This is how cultural change settles into everyday life. not through dramatic transformation, but through repeated small adjustments in habit. You move back toward the harbour. Ships are arriving and departing continuously now. The system feels self-sustaining. Goods arrive from distant regions, others leave toward equally distant destinations, and within this cycle, spices move constantly. A mainstream historical fact shows that the expansion of maritime trade networks during antiquity and the early medieval period laid the foundation for sustained interregional exchange systems that would later become global in scale, with spices playing a central role in maintaining economic viability due to their high value-to-weight ratio. You watch another ship depart, its sails catch the wind. The vessel slowly becomes a moving point of connection between distant worlds, and within its cargo are small quantities of aromatic substances that will travel far beyond their place of origin. It is striking how something so small can carry so much influence, because spices are no longer just part of trade. They are part of expectation itself. And once expectation exists across distance, the world begins to behave as a single connected system. You move forward again, and the ocean no longer feels like a boundary separating worlds, but like a continuous surface of possibility. Ships appear more frequently now, and their routes feel increasingly reliable, as if the sea itself has been quietly organized by generations of repeated journeys. Coastal cities are no longer endpoints. They are nodes in a widening system of exchange. Fire remains central in every settlement you pass, but its relationship with the distant trade is becoming more direct. Cooking is no longer just local adaptation. It is influenced by ingredients that arrive from far away, carrying with them unfamiliar scents, unfamiliar heat, unfamiliar depth. Spices are no longer rare surprises. They are becoming integrated expectations in elite kitchens and increasingly visible in ordinary households as well. A widely recognized historical understanding of early maritime commerce along the Indian Ocean indicates that coastal societies developed highly adaptive trade systems that synchronize with seasonal monsoon winds, enabling predictable movement of goods, people, and culinary materials across vast distances. You arrive on a different coastline where the air feels heavier, more humid, and saturated with layered aromas. This is a major port of arrival and redistribution. Goods from ships are not simply unloaded, they are processed, sorted, and redirected inland along river systems and caravan routes. Spices enter this system like concentrated fragments of distant landscapes. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, dried roots, and aromatic resins now move through structured hands. Traders handle them with familiarity that suggests routine rather than rarity, yet their value remains exceptionally high. They are still treated with a kind of quiet respect, as if each small bundle carries the weight of the journey that brought it here. A lesser-known archaeological interpretation suggests that spice storage facilities in early port cities were often located near administrative centres, indicating that these goods were closely monitored due to their economic importance and role in taxation systems. You walk through warehouses where goods from multiple regions are stored side by side, textiles from inland valleys, metals from mountainous regions, ceramics shaped by coastal workshops, and among them, small containers of spices stand out because of their density of meaning compared to their physical size. This is where systems begin to formalize. Measurement becomes more consistent. Weighing practices develop. Quality assessment becomes slightly more standardized, even if still based heavily on sensory evaluation. Spices require this precision because small differences in quantity or quality can significantly alter perceived value. A cultural observation frequently noted in studies of early trade societies is that high-value aromatic goods often contributed to the development of more refined measurement systems, as their economic importance demanded greater consistency in exchange practices. You follow a group of traders moving inland from the port. Their journey is slower than maritime travel, but equally important. They carry goods along riverbanks and established paths that connect coastal economies with inland populations. Along these routes, spices begin to take on new roles. They are no longer only luxury items, they are becoming cultural markers. You notice how they are used in different contexts in elite households. Spices are part of elaborate meals designed to demonstrate wealth and access. In medicinal contexts, they are valued for their perceived ability to balance bodily conditions. In ritual spaces, they are burned or offered as part of symbolic practices that connect human activity with spiritual meaning. A well-established historical perspective recognizes that in many early civilizations, aromatic substances occupied a dual role in both culinary and medicinal systems, reflecting a pre-modern understanding of health and flavor as interconnected domains. You pause in an inland settlement where trade routes converge. The atmosphere here is different from coastal cities. Less maritime influence, more terrestrial structure, but spices are still present, and in some ways even more valued here because of their distance from source regions. People gather in small groups around exchange points. Goods are displayed, discussions unfold, and among the most carefully examined items are the smallest ones. A pinch of pepper, a fragment of dried bark, a small bundle of aromatic seeds. Their value is not just economic, it is experiential. People here describe what they remember from previous encounters with these flavors. They recall meals from distant places. They associate certain aromas with warmth, celebration, or healing. A nuanced scholarly interpretation proposes that early long-distance trade in spices was supported not only by material demand but also by the formation of shared sensory memory across geographically separated communities. You begin to see how memory itself becomes part of trade. A flavor experienced once creates a desire that persists long after the original encounter. That desire drives movement. People seek what they remember, even if they cannot easily obtain it. This is a powerful mechanism, because it transforms experience into motivation. You continue through the settlement and observe how spices are integrated into daily life. Cooking practices here are adapted to available ingredients, but influenced by imported aromatics. Even small amounts of spice can alter the identity of a meal. A simple grain dish becomes something more layered. A preserved meat dish gains complexity through subtle seasoning. A widely acknowledged archaeological understanding suggests that the diffusion of spice usage into inland regions often followed trade corridors gradually, with adoption rates increasing as availability became more consistent and affordable over time. You notice that not all households use spices equally. There is variation based on access, wealth, and knowledge, but even limited use creates noticeable cultural effects. Food becomes a medium of differentiation. Those who can access spices can also signal connection to distant networks. You move into a local gathering space where food is being prepared for a communal event. The process is cooperative. People contribute ingredients. Preparation is shared, and in the center of it, spices are used sparingly but deliberately. A small amount is enough to influence the entire dish. The reaction is immediate, subtle, but noticeable. People comment not on quantity but on effect. The meal feels different, more complete, more refined. A quirky archaeological insight suggests that traces of aromatic residues found in communal cooking sites often appear in very small concentrations, indicating that even minimal spice usage was sufficient to produce culturally significant changes in food perception. You observe how knowledge continues to spread. A traveller introduces a preparation method learned in a coastal city. It is observed, adapted, and incorporated into local practice. Within a short time, it becomes part of the community's culinary identity. This is how systems evolve without formal instruction. You step back and look at the broader movement again. Coastal ports connect to inland cities. Inland cities connect to smaller settlements. Goods move along these pathways, but so does information, and spices sit at the intersection of both. A mainstream historical fact shows that interconnected trade systems across Afro-Eurasia during antiquity enabled sustained exchange of luxury goods, agricultural products, and cultural knowledge, with spices consistently functioning as one of the most important high-value commodities in these networks. You begin to understand the structure that is forming. It is not centralized. It is distributed. It is maintained, not by authority, but by repetition. Roots persist because they are useful. Exchange continues because it is desired. And spices reinforce both utility and desire simultaneously. You watch another group of traders preparing to leave. Their cargo is smaller than the volume of goods suggests in importance. Among textiles and grain, the spices are the most carefully guarded. They will travel far inland, reaching places that have never seen the coast, carrying with them the sensory identity of distant landscapes. And when they arrive, they will not just be consumed, they will be remembered and then sought again, because at this point in human history, spices are no longer just items being moved through space, they are experiences being moved through time. You move forward again, and the world feels sharper now, more contested, as if the quiet expansion of trade routes has reached a stage where connection itself begins to generate tension. The movement of goods is no longer only about access or curiosity, it is increasingly about control. And at the centre of that control, spices begin to take on a far more serious role. Fire still anchors daily life, but it is now deeply entangled with systems of authority. Cooking is influenced not only by tradition and availability, but also by regulation, taxation, and status. In elite spaces, meals are structured performances of access. In ordinary spaces, flavour is still desired, but increasingly shaped by what can realistically be obtained through local or traded means. A widely established historical understanding of late classical and early medieval trade systems indicating that control over long-distance luxury goods became a significant factor in political and economic power, especially in regions connected through maritime and caravan networks. You find yourself moving along expanding trade corridors that feel more deliberate than before. These are not just paths worn by use, they are increasingly monitored, taxed, and defended. Goods moving along them are recorded more systematically, and among all categories of goods, aromatic substances are treated with exceptional attention. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, dried resins, and fragrant seeds are no longer just desirable commodities, they are strategic resources. Their movement is tracked because their value accumulates across distance. A small quantity carried from one region can represent enormous value in another. A lesser-known archaeological interpretation suggests that early administrative seals and storage markings found on containers of aromatic goods indicate early attempts to regulate and authenticate spice shipments across trade networks. You move into a fortified trade city. Walls are more prominent here. Gates regulate entry. Inside, commercial activity is dense and highly organized. Merchants operate within defined spaces. Taxes are collected at predictable points, and spices move through this system like concentrated wealth. You notice how different groups interact with these goods. Local traders see them as profitable exchange items. Administrators see them as taxable resources. Elite households see them as markers of refinement and power. Each perspective reinforces their importance in different ways. A cultural observation frequently noted in historical economic studies is that high-value commodities often become central to early administrative systems because their concentrated value makes them efficient sources of taxation and wealth accumulation. You pause in a storage district where goods are being inspected. Containers of spices are opened briefly, their contents evaluated through smell and appearance. This is not casual inspection, it is assessment of quality, origin, and legitimacy. Even small differences can affect their assigned value. This is where spice begins to shift from trade good to controlled asset. You move deeper into the administrative layers of the city. Records are being kept. Transactions are documented in early forms of accounting. Spices appear frequently in these records, often listed alongside precious metals and textiles. Their presence in documentation reflects their economic significance. A well-established historical perspective recognizes that in many early complex economies, aromatic spices were among the earliest commodities to be systematically recorded due to their high value-to-weight ratio and importance in long-distance exchange. You begin to see how routes that once felt open are now becoming structured. Caravan paths are monitored. Maritime passages are influenced by political control, and regions begin to assert dominance over the key segments of the spice flow. Control over movement becomes control over wealth, and wealth begins to concentrate. You follow a caravan leaving the city. The journey inland is long. Crossing varied terrain, mountains, plains, and river crossings all shape the pace of movement. Along the way, spices are carefully protected. They are not bulky, but they're extremely valuable. Their loss would represent significant economic damage. You notice how traders treat them differently from other goods. There is caution, there is awareness of risk, and there is a sense that these small containers carry disproportionate responsibility. A nuanced, scholarly interpretation proposes that the increasing value of spices in long-distance trade systems contributed to the development of more secure transportation practices and early forms of organized merchant protection networks. You arrive at an inland trading hub where multiple caravan routes intersect. The environment is active but controlled. Goods are exchanged in structured sequences. Negotiation is more formalized than in earlier eras. And spices again stand out as a central category of exchange. Here, they are not just consumed, they are redistributed. They move outward again from this hub into smaller regions, extending their reach further than before. You observe how knowledge travels with them. A merchant describes how certain spices are used in coastal regions. Another explains how they are valued differently inland. These conversations shape expectations and influence demand. A mainstream historical fact shows that during the expansion of interconnected trade networks across Afro-Eurasia, spices became one of the most consistently traded luxury commodities, linking distant economic zones through sustained exchange systems. You walk through a marketplace where spices are displayed in small, measured quantities. Their presentation is careful. Sometimes they are stored in sealed containers, sometimes displayed openly for sensory evaluation. Buyers often rely on smell as much as visual inspection. This sensory reliance is important. It means that value is not abstract, it is experienced directly. You notice how people react to different aromas. Some spices are associated with warmth, others with intensity, others with medicinal qualities. These associations influence trade decisions in subtle but powerful ways. A quirky archaeological detail suggests that some ancient trading communities used standardized containers not only for measurement but also for preserving aromatic consistency during transport, indicating early awareness of environmental effects on spice quality. You move into a residential district where spices are increasingly visible in domestic life. They are not only used by elites anymore, their presence is spreading, though unevenly. Some households use them sparingly, others more regularly, but their cultural significance is broadly recognized. Meals are becoming more layered in flavor. Even simple dishes may include small additions of aromatic material. This changes how food is perceived. It is no longer just sustenance, it is experience. A cultural insight frequently discussed in anthropological research is that the gradual integration of luxury food items into everyday consumption patterns often reflects broader shifts in trade accessibility and cultural aspiration. You observe a family preparing food in a modest home. The ingredients are simple, but a small amount of imported spice is added carefully. The effect is immediate. The aroma fills the space, conversation slows slightly, attention shifts toward the meal. This is not excess, it is transformation. You continue through the city and notice how political and economic structures increasingly intersect with spice movement. Control over trade routes means control over access, and access means influence over consumption patterns. Certain groups begin to specialize in managing this flow, not only transporting goods but regulating their movement, assessing their value, and ensuring their distribution aligns with administrative priorities. A widely recognized historical interpretation suggests that control over luxury commodity networks played a significant role in the development of early state economies, particularly in regions connected by long-distance trade routes. You pause again at the edge of the city where caravans prepare to depart. Goods are loaded carefully. Spices are placed in secure positions within larger cargo arrangements. The organization reflects their importance. They are small, but they are central to economic balance. As the caravan begins to move, you realize something important about this stage of history. Spices are no longer just traveling through networks. They are shaping the structure of those networks. Every route exists partly because of them. Every hub gains importance through them. Every exchange system becomes more stable because of their consistent demand. And in that sense, they are no longer passive goods. They are active forces in the organization of human connection. You move forward again, and the world begins to feel more tightly bound by control than by simple connection. Trade routes still stretch across vast distances, but now they are no longer only pathways of exchange. They are becoming territories of influence. Whoever controls key points along these routes begins to shape not just movement, but value itself. Fire still anchors daily life, yet its role in society is increasingly stratified. In some places, it represents abundance and refinement. In others, it is simply survival. Food reflects this divide clearly. What is added to a meal now signals more than preference. It signals access. You find yourself drawn toward a region of extraordinary importance, a cluster of islands surrounded by ocean routes that seem deceptively quiet. The water looks calm, but beneath that calm lies a concentration of global desire. These islands produce something rare, something intensely aromatic, something that has already begun to reshape entire trade systems. Spices are no longer a general category here, they are specific, localized, and fiercely controlled. Cloves, nutmeg, and mace are not just plants, they are economic anchors. A well-established historical understanding shows that certain island regions in Southeast Asia became the exclusive natural source of highly valued spices, making them central to long-distance trade networks that connected Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. You move closer to one of these islands. The air is humid, dense, and saturated with plant life that feels almost overwhelming in its richness. The landscape is green in a way that feels layered, as if every surface is alive with growth. But beneath this natural abundance lies a very specific economic reality. These spices do not grow everywhere. They grow here, and that fact changes everything. You observe local communities tending to trees that produce aromatic seeds and flower structures that will later be dried and traded. The knowledge of cultivation, harvesting, and preparation is highly specialized. It is not simply agricultural practice, it is inherited expertise tied to geography. A lesser-known archaeological insight suggests that early cultivation of spice-producing plants in these regions was closely guarded within local communities, with knowledge transmission occurring through controlled familial or communal lines. You begin to see how control over natural resources translates directly into political and economic leverage. If something exists in only one place, then access to it becomes dependent on negotiation, alliance, or force. This is where tension begins to build. You notice that traders arriving at the islands are no longer casual visitors. They are agents of larger systems. They represent distant markets where demand for these spices has grown intensely. The journey here is long, risky, and expensive, but the return value is enormous. A cultural observation frequently noted in historical trade studies is that geographic monopolies on high-value goods often lead to the emergence of complex power structures, where local producers and distant buyers become entangled in prolonged systems of negotiation and dependency. You move through a coastal settlement where goods are being prepared for export. Spices are carefully dried, sorted, and packed. The process is meticulous. Every step matters because even slight degradation in quality can significantly reduce value at destination markets. The air here is filled with intense aroma, not subtle, not background, constant and unavoidable. It clings to everything. Wood, fabric, skin, even the wind seems to carry it. You notice how people here treat these materials differently from earlier regions. There is awareness of their global importance. Even if they are locally common, their external value is understood. A mainstream historical fact indicates that island regions producing rare spices became central nodes in global maritime trade systems, attracting merchants, navigators, and eventually political powers seeking to control access to these resources. You follow a shipment being prepared for departure. The spices are loaded into vessels with extreme care. They are not bulky, but they represent enormous economic weight. Their storage is designed to protect aroma, prevent moisture, and preserve integrity over long voyages. Every container feels like a condensed fragment of the island itself, about to be dispersed across the world. You step back and observe the broader pattern. Ships leave this region carrying not just goods, but concentrated value that will increase as it travels into areas where these spices do not naturally exist. And that imbalance creates pressure. You begin to see how external powers become interested in controlling these routes, not just for trade, but for monopoly. If access can be controlled, then value can be concentrated. If value can be concentrated, then power follows. Historians still debate whether early external involvement in spice-producing regions was primarily driven by commercial ambition or by broader geopolitical competition for maritime dominance. Though most evidence suggests a combination of economic and strategic motivations, you move into a trading post where foreign merchants and local producers interact. The atmosphere is structured but tense. Negotiations occur over quantities, prices, and transport arrangements. Language barriers exist, but trade can take use through shared understanding of value. Spices are central in every negotiation, not because they are the only goods, but because they are the most transformative. A quirky archaeological observation suggests that some early trading records from spice-producing regions show unusually detailed attention to quality grading, indicating an early form of standardized assessment for aromatic goods. You notice how systems of measurement become increasingly important here. Small differences in weight or quality can have significant financial implications. This leads to more precise handling, more careful storage, and more formalized agreements. You begin to understand how specialization deepens. Local producers focus on cultivation and preparation. Traders focus on transport and exchange. External buyers focus on distribution and consumption. Each layer depends on the others, and at the center of all of it are these small aromatic materials. You watch another ship depart. It carries spices that will travel across oceans, through multiple ports, across different cultures, eventually reaching places that have no direct connection to their origin. Yet their presence will be felt strongly, because once introduced, these flavors do not remain external. They enter kitchens, rituals, and memories. They become part of expectation. A cultural insight frequently highlighted in studies of early globalization processes is that certain commodities, particularly spices, played a foundational role in connecting distant societies through shared sensory experiences. Even in the absence of shared language or political systems, you stand at the shoreline as the ship disappears into the horizon. The water stretches endlessly. The trade wind shifts slightly, And you realize something fundamental about this stage of history. Control over spices is no longer just economic, it is structural. It shapes who connects to whom. It shapes who benefits from distance. It shapes how entire regions relate to one another. And that means these small objects are no longer just being moved through the world. They are helping define how the world is organized. You move forward again, and the world feels more enclosed by systems than ever before. The open fluidity of earlier exchange routes is still present, but now it is overlaid with structure, authority, and long-range ambition. Trade is no longer just a natural consequence of human movement. It is becoming something managed, optimized, and increasingly monopolized. Fire remains at the center of life, but now it reflects hierarchy more clearly than ever. In wealthy households, meals are composed with extraordinary attention to detail. In poorer spaces, food is shaped by availability and necessity, yet across both, spices remain a point of aspiration. Even a small amount signals connection to distant worlds. You find yourself moving into an era where large organized trading systems begin to dominate maritime exchange. Ships are no longer just merchant vessels. They are part of structured networks involving investors, administrators, navigators, and armed escorts. The sea is still vast, but it is increasingly mapped, measured, and divided into routes of strategic importance. A widely established historical understanding notes that the expansion of early chartered trading organizations in the late medieval and early modern periods marked a turning point in global commerce. As long-distance trade became increasingly organized under centralized institutions with significant political backing, you observe ships repairing in fortified harbors. These are not casual departures. They are carefully planned expeditions, cargo is recorded in detail, routes are selected based on seasonal winds, political conditions, and risk assessments. Among all goods being transported, spices remain one of the most valuable and strategically significant categories. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and related aromatics are no longer just luxury goods. They are economic instruments. Their value is high enough that entire voyages are justified by their return alone. A lesser-known historical insight suggests that detailed shipping logs from early maritime enterprises frequently assign disproportionate attention to spice cargo compared to bulk commodities, reflecting their exceptional financial importance in the trade accounting systems. You move aboard one of these vessels as it leaves harbour. The transition from land to sea feels like entering a different logic system. Everything becomes dependent on wind, navigation skill, and timing. The ship moves slowly at first, then gains rhythm as it aligns with established maritime currents. Below deck, cargo is tightly organized. Spices are stored in sealed containers, protected from moisture and air exposure. Even slight changes in humidity or temperature could reduce their quality, and therefore their value. You begin to notice how carefully they are treated, not because they are fragile in a physical sense, but because their value is highly sensitive to condition. A cultural observation frequently noted in historical economic studies is that high-value aromatic commodities often required the development of specialized preservation techniques, which in turn influence broader advancements in storage and transportation technologies. You watch as the coastline slowly recedes, the ship enters open water. Days and nights begin to blend into a continuous rhythm of wind, sail, and navigation. Yet even in this isolation, the cargo remains central to purpose. Every movement of the ship is oriented toward preserving and delivering these goods. Spices are now part of a much larger system of expectation. Distant markets anticipate their arrival. Prices are already influenced by their projected supply. Even before reaching land, their economic impact has already begun. You begin to see how information travels alongside goods, reports of cargo, expected arrival times, and quality expectations move ahead of the ship itself. Value is no longer confined to physical presence. it is projected across distance. A mainstream historical fact shows that early maritime trade systems relied heavily on prearranged agreements and forward expectations of cargo delivery, particularly for high-value goods such as spices, textiles, and precious materials. You arrive at a major coastal trading hub where multiple maritime routes converge. The harbour is dense with activity. Ships from different regions dock side by side, languages overlap. Goods are unloaded and redistributed with practiced efficiency. Spices once again stand out among the cargo. They are handled with particular care, often separated from bulk goods and placed under stricter supervision. Their movement is tracked more closely than most other items. You notice how traders interact with them. There is recognition of origin, quality, and rarity. Even small variations in aroma or texture can significantly affect perceived value. A quirky archaeological observation suggests that early trade centres often developed informal sensory evaluation practices for spices, where experienced merchants could distinguish regional origins based on scent and texture alone. You move through inland distribution routes connected to this port. Goods are transported further into continental interiors. Spices follow these paths into regions far removed from their origin. As they move inland, their rarity increases, and so does their symbolic weight. In some places, they are used in food preparation. In others, they are reserved for special occasions, rituals, or elite consumption. Their presence signals access to distant systems of exchange. You begin to understand how geography transforms perception. The farther spices travel from their source, the more they accumulate meaning. They are no longer just agricultural products, they are representations of distance itself. A nuanced scholarly interpretation proposes that the cultural significance of spices in inland regions was shaped not only by their sensory qualities but also by their association with distant trade networks and the prestige of global connectivity. You observe a marketplace where spices are being sold in carefully measured quantities. Small weights are used to ensure fairness. Transactions are precise. Buyers inspect goods closely, often relying on smell as much as visual inspection. The atmosphere is structured, but deeply sensory. Every interaction involves evaluation not just of quantity, but of quality and intensity. You watch a purchase take place. A small bundle of pepper is exchanged for a larger volume of grain. The imbalance in size is not questioned. It is understood. Value here is defined by transformation potential, not physical mass. A widely recognized historical interpretation indicates that early commercial systems increasingly relied on standardized exchange relationships for high-value goods, particularly aromatic spices, which played a central role in the development of early economic valuation frameworks. You move into a residential area where spices are becoming more visible in everyday life. Cooking practices are adapting. Even simple meals may include small additions of aromatic materials. The effect is subtle but meaningful. Flavor becomes more layered, more intentional. Households that use spices more frequently are often perceived as having greater access to trade networks or higher social standing. This creates a feedback loop between consumption and status. You notice how people talk about food differently now. They describe not just what it is, but how it feels. Warmth, depth, intensity, balance. These sensory terms begin to form a shared vocabulary that transcends specific ingredients. A cultural insight frequently observed in anthropological research is that the introduction of widely circulated luxury food items often leads to the development of more nuanced sensory language within affected societies. You pause again near the edge of the settlement. Trade routes stretch outward in multiple directions. Some lead back to ports, others extend deep into inland territories. And along all of them, spices continue to move steadily, carried by systems that are becoming more complex and more interconnected. A mainstream historical fact indicates that by the late medieval period, global trade networks had become increasingly integrated across multiple continents, with spices playing a central role in sustaining long-distance economic exchange between Asia, Africa, and Europe. You watch another caravan depart. The containers are small, but their significance is enormous. Each one carries not just material value, but accumulated distance, labor, and expectation. They are woven into the experience of what it means to eat in a connected world. You move forward one final time, and the noise of global systems begins to soften in a way that feels almost unnatural at first. Not because the world has become quieter, but because you're beginning to perceive it differently. The movement of goods, the complexity of supply chains, the endless circulation of products across continents all remain present. Yet your attention shifts away from the machinery of exchange and towards something more subtle that has always been inside it. Fire still anchors human life, but now it feels less like a physical necessity and more like a shared cultural memory expressed in kitchens across the world. Every meal, regardless of location or income, still passes through heat, and every heated meal, in some way, carries the long history of transformation that began with humans first discovering that flavor could be changed on purpose. You are no longer moving through trade routes or empires or logistics systems. You are moving through perception itself, and in that space, spices no longer appear as commodities. They appear as accumulated meaning. A widely recognized historical understanding in global food history emphasizes that modern culinary systems are the result of long-term interaction between environmental resources, human migration, and evolving cultural preferences, with spices remaining one of the most consistent elements linking ancient food practices to contemporary cuisine. You find yourself in quiet everyday spaces now, a kitchen at night, a small market in the morning, a restaurant preparing meals before opening. These places no longer feel separate from history. They feel like its continuation. A pinch of spice added to a dish is not just seasoning. It is a continuation of thousands of years of movement, negotiation, adaptation, and memory. And you begin to notice how deeply integrated spices are into emotional life. They're not just about flavor. They're about recognition. A smell that feels familiar can trigger memories that are not fully conscious. A taste can feel like comfort without explanation. These responses are not new. They're inherited from generations of human experience shaped by sensory exploration. A lesser-known historical insight suggests that sensory materials such as spices may have played a significant role in shaping early human emotional memory systems due to their repeated association with safety, warmth, healing, and social gathering. You move through ordinary daily routines, people preparing meals without thinking about the global system that make those ingredients possible, and yet every action is connected to distant geographies, ancient roots, and historical decisions that shaped what is available today. Spices arrive quietly in these moments. They are measured without ceremony, added without recognition of their global journey. And yet their effect is immediate. They transform not only flavor, but perception of the entire meal. You begin to see how invisibility becomes part of their power. The more integrated they become, the less they are noticed as extraordinary. And yet their influence remains profound. A cultural observation frequently noted in food anthropology is that ingredients with long histories of global circulation often become culturally invisible over time, even as their impact on taste, identity, and tradition remains deeply significant. You step back again and the global system reappears in your awareness, not as a network of routes or economies, but as a continuous flow of experience. Goods move constantly, but more importantly, expectations move constantly. People expect certain flavors, certain sensations, certain consistencies in food that are only possible because of long histories of spice movement. You begin to understand that spices are not just objects that traveled through history. They are forces that help define how humans relate to food across time. A mainstream historical fact indicates that the development of global food systems was heavily influenced by the long-distance circulation of aromatic and flavor-enhancing commodities, which helped shape shared culinary practices across geographically distant societies. You move through memory itself now, where past and present begin to overlap. Early humans crushing seeds near firelight, traders crossing oceans, merchants negotiating in crowded ports, ships moving through monsoon winds, modern kitchens quietly reproducing flavors that originated in distant ecosystems. All of these moments are connected not by a single system, but by continuity of desire. Historians still reflect on whether the global spread of spices was driven more by elite consumption patterns or by widespread human attraction to sensory variety. But what becomes clear across time is that once flavor enhancement entered human behavior, it never stopped expanding. You find yourself no longer observing history as something external. It feels internal now. Spices are no longer moving through the world. They are part of how the world is experienced. A quirky historical detail suggests that even in highly industrialized food systems, the most complex flavor profiles often still rely on combinations of spices whose usage patterns trace directly back to ancient trade routes and traditional culinary practices. You begin to slow down further. The complexity of systems fades into background awareness. What remains is simpler. A meal being prepared, heat rising, aroma forming, a moment of anticipation before eating. And in that moment, nothing about it feels modern or ancient. It simply feels human. You realize that across all the sections you have moved through, from wild plants near firelight to global distribution systems spanning continents, one pattern has remained constant. Humans continuously seek to improve the experience of eating, not only for survival, but for meaning, comfort, and pleasure. Spices are one of the clearest expressions of that pattern. They began as accidental discoveries in nature. They became tools of healing and preservation. They turned into symbols of wealth and power. They shaped trade routes, influenced empires, and guided exploration across oceans. And finally, they became ordinary again, integrated into daily life so completely that their extraordinary history is often forgotten. A widely recognized historical interpretation suggests that the enduring global presence of spices reflects one of the longest continuous chains of cultural and economic exchange in human history, linking early human experimentation directly to modern food systems without interruption. You are no longer following that chain. You are inside it, and as the final layer settles, the story does not end abruptly. It softens, it slows, it becomes less about movement and more about presence. A kitchen light, a quiet table, a warm meal, a familiar aroma rising gently into the air. And somewhere inside that aroma is everything you have seen. Every journey, every trade route, every ocean crossing, every hand that ever crushed, carried, or cooked something fragrant in the hope that food might taste just a little more alive. The world is still moving, but you do not need to follow it anymore. It is already here, and it has always been here. So now, you can simply rest. Sweet dreams.